This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins the show as he discusses a part of the Clean Water Act. He talks about how agricultural irrigation has a return flow exemption. K-State's Jenny Ifft and Joe Parcell keep today's show rolling as they explain the debt repayment capacity for U.S. crop businesses. They explain major contributors and what they are watching. Ending the show is Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers, and Phillip Lancaster, with special guest Juliana Ranches as they converse about figures from the cattle inventory report. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show with K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen talking about the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
Roger, what is the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System?
Well, that's a good question. It's part of the Clean Water Act, and more specifically, the Clean Water Act amendments of 1972. And in a nutshell, the federal government has said that if you're going to discharge a pollutant, and that's a specifically defined term, it's got a little bit broader application than one would normally think when we refer to the term pollutant. But if you're going to discharge a pollutant into the navigable waters of the United States, so into a WOTUS, you have to have a permit. And that's what this system is, the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System. It's an NPDES permit. I have to have a federal permit.
Is there a part of agriculture that's almost exempt from this?
Yeah, there's a big exemption for ag irrigation return flows. So irrigation return flows are exempt in agriculture from the permit requirement. And you can discharge into groundwater even if it's hydrologically connected to surface water without a permit.
And there are a couple of cases that go along with this, and one of them being a 2020 case.
Yeah, that was a 2020 U.S. Supreme Court decision involving the county of Maui in Hawaii. And what the court said there was, and I won't belabor the facts of that case, but they came up with a multi-factor test, a 7-factor test to determine whether an indirect discharge is really a direct discharge, which would require a permit. And that involved, I'll mention the facts a little bit, it involved a wastewater treatment facility on Maui. And they would treat the water before it would go into, they'd treat sewage before it would go into the Pacific Ocean. Well, the question was, do they need a federal permit to do that? And the court set up a 7-factor test for determining whether you have to have a permit in those situations.
What are those different factors?
Well, what's the nature of the material through which the pollutant travels? That's one of those. What's the transit time? What's the distance that it's traveled? What's the extent to which the pollutant is diluted or chemically changed as it travels? And what's the amount of the pollutant that enters navigable waters relative to the amount of pollutant that leaves the point source? And, of course, the wastewater treatment facility is the point source in that case. Another one is the manner by or area in which the pollutant enters the navigable waters and the degree to which the pollution at that point has maintained its specific identity. Now, I think in most of these cases that we've seen since then, time and distance are the most important factors in most cases, but not necessarily every one.
And another case that plays into all of this, the Maryland case, and what is that case?
Well, in that case, and this is a recent decision right at the end of 2024, there was a town in Maryland that applied for a groundwater discharge permit from the Maryland Department of Environment for wastewater treatment facility that was going to dispose treated effluent through spray irrigation onto crop fields. And that permit had the effluent limitations in it. It also specified requirements for nutrient management plan and conditions to ensure that there would be complete uptake of the nutrients by vegetation, resulting in net zero discharge to groundwater or surface waters. And so that was all in the permit, and the permit allowed the use of spray irrigation to discharge up to 100,000 gallons of treated wastewater per day onto farm fields in the county. And, of course, they got their state permit there, and there was a group that challenged it and said, well, you need a federal permit too. And that was the battle. Do they need a federal permit or not? And to decide that, then this Maryland Court of Appeals looked at what we call the Maui factors to determine whether they needed a federal permit. And based on that analysis, they said, no, you don't need one.
Why did the Maui factors not include into this, do we need a permit, do we not need a permit?
Well, the Maryland Department of Environment here, the court said, did things correctly, and they said that the record supported the state's findings and conclusions. They said the department determined the discharge was not the functional equivalent of a direct discharge to surface waters, and that was supported by substantial evidence because the state Environmental Department had already considered the Maui factors in determining whether there should be an additional federal permit. They went through the analysis, and the court said they went through that analysis as laid out by the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, entirely properly, and they provided a detailed factual basis for their conclusion. And they said there was a nutrient management plan that was included with the permit that would ensure 100% uptake of nutrients as state law required, and that was supported by the evidence. And so the evidence supported what the state was doing here, and they properly applied, the court said, the 7 factors that came out of the Supreme Court's Maui opinion. And so the court said, we're not going to change that. The state did its work here. The administrative agency did its work. We're not going to change that result. And so there was no federal NPDES permit that was required.
Is this something that you think is going to have more cases related to it in the future?
Well, in terms of its impact on ag irrigation activities, if there is an impact, that's where it would be, because that exemption is a big exemption for agriculture. And so the question has come up, well, will these cases impact that at all? And, initially the Maui case would have an impact because you'd have to analyze irrigation activities based on the 7 factors that the U.S. Supreme Court laid out. However, there have been a couple of developments since the 2020 opinion of the Supreme Court. One came down in 2023, May 25 of 2023, and that's the Sackett case. And we've talked about that. You and I have talked about the Sackett opinion. That's a WOTUS opinion, and it really narrows the scope of the application of the permit system to adjacent wetlands. And so that narrows the scope of a required permit. It narrows the application of the Maui factors in certain situations. You'll have fewer cases that come up as a result of that. And then last year was the big Chevron decision, and we've talked about that on this program before, where the deference given to administrative agencies now is less. We use what's now known as Skidmore deference, and that is basically the courts are telling the administrative agencies, no, you're not the experts on construing what statutory language means. We are. That's the court's job. And so the agencies get much less deference. And I think when you put Sackett and Chevron together, since the Maui opinion came out in 2020, you're going to have fewer situations where the ag irrigation return flow exemption would be questioned.
Is there anything you recommend that agricultural operations maybe take the time to take a look at, implement, or understand what they're doing?
Well, common sense always goes a long ways. And I think anytime you can use more efficient irrigation systems to minimize runoff and ensure that water is used more effectively, that's a good idea. And that could include drip irrigation or soil moisture sensors or any other technologies that reduce water waste. And then also establish buffer zones and vegetation around water bodies, if you can, to help filter things out before they reach navigable waters. And adopt nutrient management practices to help prevent excess fertilizers from entering water bodies, including the use of precision agriculture techniques that apply fertilizers more accurately and efficiently. And then in areas of the country where it's possible, and some places in Kansas it's not, and some areas as you get further north it's not, but plant a cover crop to reduce soil erosion and runoff and improve soil health. All of those things, if you fit them in your overall management plan for your farm, can help minimize issues where the courts would get involved.
Is this something you're keeping an eye on as we look forward?
It is. This was an important case that came out of Maryland. Again, I think we'll see fewer and fewer of these cases, and I think that ag irrigation return flow exemption is pretty solid.
So, Roger, as we sum up these different cases in the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, what are really the key points of things that could impact agriculture or people using water? Well,
keep in mind the NPDES, the federal permit system, only applies to point source discharges. That's usually not a problem for agriculture because agriculture is dealing with diffuse surface runoff. So often we don't have point source pollutants. However, if you have a situation where perhaps you're irrigating, it gets into a grass waterway, and from that grass waterway the water collects and goes into a navigable water, and we don't have too many of those in Kansas, but let's say it's the Kansas River or it's the Missouri River. Those are a couple of them that come to mind. Then you could have the potential for the application of an NPDES permit. Then you've got the irrigation return flow exemption. Okay, so you have to layer that on top. Ag has an exemption for irrigation return flows that might apply. Well, in this instance, that was at issue in this case, and then you would apply the Maui factors, but with, again, the opinions by the Supreme Court subsequent to that case in 23 and 24, I think you'll have much less interaction of the law with respect to irrigation activities for agriculture. I think that's the main point.
If people want to read more on this topic or other topics related to agricultural law or taxation, how can they do that?
They can find that on AgManager through the Ag Econ Department at K-State.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was Kansas State University and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. If you'd like to read more on this topic, one way you can do that is by checking out his recent blog article titled Agriculture's Irrigation Return Flow Exemption. I will link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to K-State's agricultural economics website, AgManager.info. Again, that is AgManager.info. If you'd like to find other work from Roger, you can do so by going to the AgManager.info website, clicking on Contributors, and then clicking on Roger McEowen. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State's Jenny Ifft and Joe Parcell to discuss debt repayment. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about a recent publication titled Debt Repayment Capacity Among U.S. Crop Farm Businesses with K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft and Director of the Center for Risk Management at K-State, Joe Parcell. Jenny, Joe, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Jenny, what is debt repayment capacity?
It's a measure of farm financial health, and what it looks at is a farm's ability to meet their debt obligations, so principal and interest payments, with their current farm income.
Is this something that was then you're able to calculate by looking at past years of what we think 2025 is going to be?
More or less, you got it. So what we're looking at is forecast net cash farm business income for 2024 and 2025. So we use the USDA forecast for that. On the debt side, we're also using USDA data on farm businesses that specialize in crop production, and we're looking at their balance sheet, and we're projecting what their debt obligations are going to be in 24 and 25. So what are their projected principal payments? What are their projected interest payments?
Why is this something that we should maybe care about?
Well, I think it's an early warning sign for financial stress in the farm sector. And if you look at the components of that, you can see it. Currently today in the United States, we have the largest inflation-adjusted amount of farm debt on record. So we've been adding debt for 30 years. And typically farms can manage this, but on the crop farm side, we're looking at crop farm business income that is at its lowest level in 2 decades after adjusting for inflation. So you have these two things that are, moving in a concerning direction, and we want to understand what the relationship is.
And what are some of those estimated debt repayment capacities when looking at crop farms specializing in certain crops?
Well, before I get to that, I'd like to sort of clarify what type of farms we're looking at. So again, this is using U.S. data for the whole country. We are looking at farm businesses. So these are farms that have they're above a certain level of sales, so $350,000, or farming is their primary source of income. So these type of farms account for 90% of production. So if you want to look at financial stress in production agriculture, that's where you're going to look. And these are farms that specialize in corn, wheat, soybean production. So that's where most of their income is at. So this year, especially 2024 and 2025, you really have to look at crops and livestock separately because their incomes are moving in different directions.
So what do you see when you look at crops?
Well, what we see is that this debt service coverage ratio is right around 1. So for farm businesses that specialize in corn, it would be 1.1 for 2024 and 1.0 for 2025. Very similar for soybeans. So that tells us that the expected level of income is only slightly higher than their debt obligations. And this is for the average farm. For wheat, it's looking, it's even more sobering. So for wheat, it's 0.56 for 2024. And then for those wheat farm businesses for 2025, it's 0.8. So their forecast net cash income is lower than their debt obligations.
While this is looking at all of U.S. crop farm businesses, seeing a similar picture when you just kind of think about Kansas crop farm businesses?
I would say it's largely consistent with what we're seeing in Kansas. This is an average. So, we've been asking about, talking to lenders when we do extension events, asking about financial conditions. We talk to individual producers. And what I've been hearing since the fall is, it's a period of belt tightening. Some farms are okay. Some farms are in trouble. This is an average. So, it kind of captures that general situation.
As we're talking about this, does this factor in livestock, cattle sales when it comes to U.S. crop businesses?
Well, indirectly. So this is the average farm business that specializes in corn. Some small share of that's going to be livestock, the average livestock share. And so that part of their income forecast will reflect that. So to a small degree, again, it's an average. I know in Kansas, if you have crop farms that also maybe are selling some calves, that's really helped out recently.
Joe, what ripple effects does this potentially have?
Yeah, Shelby. So, we've been talking here about the one side of the equation, and that's the farm business and whether it's able to, be able to meet its debt obligations and interest payments. But you got to think about who's providing that credit. That's your local banks, that's your local equipment dealers, that's our input suppliers, fertilizer, seed, etc. And depending on the situation of those different input providers and service providers, the flip side of this is that money just doesn't disappear, or that credit doesn't appear. So if the farm's unable to meet those responsibilities, that starts having an impact on our local banks, on our local input providers in there. So there's this big ripple effect, and I think another piece of this too that's really not talked about, because what Jenny was talking about doesn't really include some of the off-farm income, which is kind of maybe a risk management strategy that could be used to help balance some of this out. What's that going to mean for maybe some of these farm families needing to go back to work and stuff and find off-farm income, especially I think of young and beginning farmers in there, just because they're already cash strapped by the nature of where they are. They don't have a big balance sheet build up where they've got a lot of equity. So there's not a lot of areas for them to go borrow. So, but again, that ripple effect's really throughout the whole community in some of these rural areas. And we're trying to watch those pretty closely of what's going on. We see a little bit that's maybe in the used equipment market where we're seeing inventories get built up and stuff, so they're unable to move. And so again, that's kind of where that ripple effect and maybe even multiplier effect starts to happen. Hearing some stories of local banks, again, a little bit of a ripple effect there, but something we're watching kind of month to month, week to week of what's going on.
Jenny, what are some things that steps producers might want to take when they're maybe a little concerned about debt repayment?
There's a lot that producers can do. And this is certainly not the first time there's been financial struggles in agriculture. So, off-farm income is one part of it. We didn't look at that. But for some farm families, that's an important strategy for managing risk. Some farms have savings. So, you save during the good times to get through the bad times. Not everybody does, beginning producers and others. But some farms will definitely be drawing on their savings, their working capital. There's also the option of refinancing. So, maybe pushing off some of your current debt obligations and refinancing to pay them later. Some farms may also be selling assets. to meet those obligations.
What are some of the extra challenges that are coming into this besides crop prices and input costs?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tackle the elephant in the room, and that's kind of, what's going to happen with tariffs policy there, because, and we already know. I mean, the Secretary of Ag and those working with the Secretary, they've already come out and said we're gonna make sure our farmers are whole. So that's the good news. What that means, though, and to what extent, we don't know that yet. But if you think about those tariffs, not only does it cut down on the demand for maybe some of our products, but on the input side, like fertilizer, the one that's talked about most right now is the potash that comes out of Canada. So there's going to be a squeezing there of the margin, which is going to make it even tougher to maybe make some of those commitments to repay that have been, those loans have been taken out in the past that we've got to repay today.
As we're talking about farm finances and debt, Jenny, what is something that you have included in all of your calculations?
Well, it does. One thing I think it's important to note is these do include the 2025 numbers, assume that payments authorized by the American Relief Act, which was from December 2024, would be paid out. So that's that $30 billion. Again, it was authorized, so the forecast assume it would be paid out. That is in those numbers that I presented.
What are you guys keeping an eye on then as we look forward?
Yeah, Shelby, it's the same things we've been watching the last couple of years. That's where commodity prices go, where input prices go, how weather's going to impact our production. You got to remember at the levels right now we're very susceptible to another downturn. Even if there might be some money coming to support them, when it gets there, it's going to be really important there, because we're at a sensitive area as low of ratios as we're at right now.
Yeah, and I think that really wraps it up really well, that, where we are right now, we are heading into it with more debt farms are holding more debt than they have in the past, and that creates additional vulnerability.
If people want to read more on this topic, how can they do that?
They need to go to AgManager.info, where we have links to these and other resources.
Jenny, Joe, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you so much.
That was K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft and Director of the Center for Risk Management at K-State, Joe Parcell. If you'd like to read more on their publication titled Debt Repayment Capacity Among U.S. Crop Farm Businesses, you can do so by going to AgManager.info, or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. This publication was done with the Rural and Farm Finance Policy Analysis Center with the University of Missouri. You can find that website by going to raff.missouri.edu. Again, that is raff.missouri.edu. I will also link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll have part of this week's Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. We end our Wednesday show on Agriculture Today with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Bob Larson, Dustin Pendell, Brian Lubbers and Phillip Lancaster, as well as special guest Juliana Ranches.
Dustin, I know you've had a new report come out, and you've got some questions for us.
Yep. So January 1, or in January, I guess, into January, the USDA always comes out with their cattle inventory report. And so the questions I guess I'm going to ask today are all related to production inventory numbers. And then from there, I'd like to just talk about what we think that means going forward. So U.S. cattle inventory numbers came out, and I'm sure you probably all read that the numbers are down. Right? Do we know what's the numbers, how much, what percent, or do we know a number?
I'll say 5%.
It's 1%.
I like Juliana's answer. I'll go 2.
3.
Got to be 4.
I guess 4 is left.
Well, yeah, she was right, 1%.
Yeah.
So since you're correct, I'll let you answer this one first. That was the lowest value since what year?
1950, I think.
Wow.
61. Close.
61.
This is closer than we would have got. You didn't even let us guess.
Yeah.
You knew you would be closer.
Wow.
So, yeah, so we're at about 86, a little over 86.5 million head. A lowest consent. So that's all cattle. That would be both dairy and beef. Now, just specifically, let's talk beef inventory. Any?
You take cows or cows and calves and feedlot, or what are we talking here?
It's just beef cattle inventory. I don't.
I think that'd be
everything.
total.
Yeah.
We're supposed to guess the total.
Or you can do a percent.
I was going to say 60,000 or 60 million.
Yeah, I was going somewhere in that ballpark too. So yeah,
I'll say 55. Yeah, I don't know. I'd be in the same ballpark as you guys, I guess.
I think it's 80-something. 87.
Well, the U.S. beef cattle inventory as of January 1, 2025 was 27.9 million.
That's got to be just be beef cows then.
That's just cows.
Yep, that would be beef cows. 1%. Again, another 1%. Okay, now cattle on feed on January 1.
Percent increase versus last year or decrease versus last year?
We can do
percent
change.
Percent change since last year.
I've got a pattern here. 1%.
You're correct. It's 1%.
So we're shrinking just a little bit across the board.
Now we'll talk about replacement heifer inventory. Beef.
That's the important one on whether we're going to grow or not. I don't think it's started to grow yet. I'm going to say down 1% again.
Exactly. Down 1%.
That means we are not growing yet.
Nope. And then what about milk cows?
Dairy herds, I'm going to say that's down. Oh, I don't know. I'll just guess 3%.
I think they're up. I'll say
I think they're up too.
I think holding steady.
Yeah, it depends on what you read. It's either hold steady or just a few cows up. So
Okay.
Now let's talk just what does that mean for specifically replacement heifers. Small inventory beef replacement heifers. What's that mean in the future?
We keep waiting for when people are going to start retaining heifers, which then the actual cow number growth lags that a while, a couple of years. But my understanding is we have not seen anything that indicates that cow numbers are going to go up soon.
We haven't been retaining heifers or growing. I mean, this has been pretty consistent pattern for what, 3-4 years now?
Yeah, but the beef production has not dropped off at the same rate because of bigger cattle feeding them a little bit longer. So that's a driver that hasn't come into play as far as we got to save heifers. But feeder calf prices have been historically good.
Yeah, which makes those heifers really valuable to sell.
Yeah, that's the tricky part.
To keep.
Yeah.
But eventually, I think last month, February's cattle on feed report, weren't the numbers down? Placements going in.
Placements
down.
at the feed yard.
Yeah.
So I just wonder if we'll eventually start to see maybe in 2025.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see as that plays through. And I think good point, because all of those inventory numbers, it's interesting because it's been a shrinking national herd if we measure at the cow level over time. So thanks for sharing those numbers with us, Dustin.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast. If you have questions for them, you can send them to bci@ksu.edu. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.